Black Cats Run podcast, episode 2, Power to Weight. I want to encourage and really also invite people to follow the Instagram page. The goal in having an Instagram page is to create a space where folks who are listening can go to share what they think. They have ideas that they want to see represented or topics they want to see covered, a space where people can post that. So it's Insta handle for that is at Black Cats Run. So check that out if you're on Instagram and that's something that's interesting to you. For this episode, I wanted to speak a little bit more directly to those of us who aren't runners or don't have a strong identity with the sport of running. I think in the first episode, a lot of times we came down to examples and contexts about running. Historically, we talked about, a lot about Paavo Nurmi as a reference point, but we, made reference to Arthur Lydiard and the New Zealand runners. We made reference to Peter Snell. We made reference to Zatopek. We didn't really refer to any specific examples of cycling. And, I think we want to emphasize that the goal of this podcast is to be an endurance sport podcast, that's what we're trying to understand. And bringing cycling and running together is something that I want to do in the podcast because I think that conceptually there's a lot to be learned from these two different things. And, no offense to swimming or speed skating or, there are other endurance disciplines out there that I recognize that I'm not maybe giving total credit or direct acknowledgement to. But to me, I would say that cycling and running are probably two of the most generally accessible activities. Running is probably the easiest to get into. It's also probably, I would say in the United States, is probably the most competitive of the endurance sports, just due to the level of massive participation and the fact that it is a sport that is, supported scholastically, that there's a pathway for that through school. But that, I think, is a part of what makes thinking about the cycling experience for people who have maybe just done cycling so interesting to talk about, because it's such a different contrast from the experience of running. And what can we learn about sport, the experience of being an endurance athlete from the experience of cyclists and people who maybe that's been, that was the sport that they've got introduced to. Did they come to that as a junior? Did they come to that as a senior athlete? Did they come to that as a master's level athlete? What has their experience been? And, I think the space around that is really different, because with running, right, we get to start out off usually like in a team environment with an organized schedule and a progression and standards and all of these benchmarks and reference points. But I get the, feeling that for cycling, a lot of people, it's something that they just sort of like discover and that maybe they had no knowledge of per se. And as an adult athlete, they suddenly sort of become immersed into this, and that experience of discovery and immersion is, I think, very different in some ways from what runners have, because running is just so prevalent. Even if you don't run as a student, you still probably were exposed to, having to do the mile in gym class or, running in some context. Running is a pretty common movement. And sure, a lot of people know how to ride bicycles. But, when you get into, endurance, bike, training and racing, it's pretty different from riding your bike around, town, or riding your bike up around, the neighborhood or the cul-de-sac or, the suburban grid, depending on, where you grew up and where you learned to ride a bike. And I think that when we're thinking about these things, like, what is the common ground? And I think that common ground can be found at a core component of their shared endurance experience. And this is something that, sets it apart a little bit from swimming in a way, in that cyclists right? We talk a lot and think a lot about this idea of power to weight ratio, and the ability to go uphill fast, matters pretty heavily in some form at the highest levels of cycling. And, you could look at that in a classics context. You could look at that in a stage racing context. You could look at that even in a criterium context. Your ability to accelerate is going to be impacted by that, right? So even if you have a criterium where you may feel that you're avoiding hills, your ability to apply, force, relative to your body mass is still going to play a role. And I think we can think of as cyclists that power to weight is sort of like one of these things, like what are the things that make cycling unique? And I think a lot of us get into cycling because its uniqueness is so appealing, and that's a part of what makes it interesting, right? Like I said, that ability to discover something on our own versus with running, what runners are having to navigate is an experience that's sort of served up for them, and especially in American culture, is really sort of put in place for them. And I think we also want to acknowledge that probably for cyclists outside of the United States, there's a very different experience. But the number of, I think it's about 250,000 high school athletes will run cross country every year in the United States. Imagine 250,000, 250,000, teenage girls and boys, juniors out riding and racing road bikes, or riding and racing gravel, or riding and racing cyclocross. That's just inconceivable. I mean, how many people, under the age of 18, on bikes are a part of an endurance, organized team? And then what really are their opportunities to race? Imagine 250,000 cyclists progressing through an organized, specific, season of competition with designed and targeted championships and all of these kinds of things in place. I think it would be totally different. But that uniqueness I think, creates an opportunity, which for our purposes, that, and there's probably multiple opportunities that you could see in this, but for what we're trying to accomplish, it creates the opportunity to see a totally different experience of endurance sport. And, I think that these concepts of discipline are still profound, and I don't think those are specific to running. I think they exist all across, right? And we did talk about, a little bit about like the FTP interval concept. But, you see things like the Cyclist Training Bible and the proliferation of the idea of zones as a result of the, power meter proliferation. Cycling, right? It's just, it's like nuclear proliferation. Everything is proliferating. And you see that, has its own effect. But I think there's a lot of similarities. And when we see the similarities, so here's, I think, something that's really kind of fascinating to try to tease out. When we see the similarities between these things, which are structured and exist very differently in terms of organization and social space. And I think for a lot of, and I, to be honest, just to be disclosure, right, I don't experience it this way, but I think that for a lot of cyclists, there's like a strong countercultural identity. And I feel that you see a lot more countercultural style with that, and like cycling style, in terms of, how people like style their appearance, and then how they style, their sort of like, leisure time, fashion, or their sort of like, fashion outside of the outside of doing exercise for the sport, I think has a lot more in common with like, mountaineering and rock climbing and, EMS type vibes than it does with cycling, which I think has than cycling does with running, where running, I'm saying this backwards and totally messed up. Let's just try again. Running, on the other hand, I think has way more of this mainstreamy feel, and sort of like a Nike type affiliation. And I think, and then you sort of have like this Brooks Brothers thing going on with Tracksmith, which is its own other kind of interesting dynamic. And I think, that would be another topic to talk about, would be how does fashion involved in, and how does that shape how we think about sports? And I think that, when we look at that distinction, right, I think we can kind of say that it's not like cycling and running are clones of each other in terms of, the social norms. Like, I think runners don't really necessarily present as countercultural, but that's something that's changed. I think if you go back, to the 70s and 80s, I think that it was still very much the case that running was pretty, like, against the grain. And I wonder, too, if in cycling, as sort of the rise and fall of, Lance Armstrong's career and his, public image and the way that's fluctuated, I wonder if, as Frank Shorter and, with the Olympic marathon success and then Joni Benoit, and, I wonder if that sort of brought running from that sort of countercultural space to that mainstream space, because you had, right, the Grateful Dead, writing lyrics about long distance runners at one time. And now it's not really, it doesn't have that same kind of status, right? It's become this very vanilla, and like Runner's World is a lifestyle magazine. And at one time, like, that publication was where you went to like try to learn about actual training ideas. And, that's just gone. But when we look at, cycling, like, did cycling sort of slide, and not that it's a bad place to be in, but did it sort of slide back on that sort of mass popularity scale? And has it sort of like reclaimed some of that countercultural space because of both the fact that there haven't been any American performers on an international level to really go out and legitimately compete on a regular basis? And no disrespect to, athletes, who have gone out and had, noteworthy race successes in international competition. But I think we would be kidding ourselves if we tried to pretend that that was recognized on a mass scale in American popular sports culture, because it hasn't. And whether that's right or wrong, that's sort of that market thing, is that, our sports culture is driven by these industry norms, which is like, if people aren't consuming it and you have this other alternative that people are consuming, you're not going to turn down that other alternative to try to develop this other thing that isn't yielding. That's the economics of opportunity cost, and that's why it's so hard to quote unquote grow any sport like cycling. And running has basically, I think, become something that's been driven by mass participation, and mass participation is what's moved to be mainstream. So very different in terms of cultural experiences, and I think running, right, more socially vanilla, and cycling taking on more of this, like, rock climbing grunge aesthetic, and that's part of that superficial. And I think that cultural stuff is kind of interesting to tease out, and that does have an effect too on the choices we make about training. But really what we're looking at there is we're talking about conformity, and that both of these sports are driven by their own desires to conform. It's just that the running conformity is just more common, and that forces it to then consequently appear more mainstream. More people do it, and if more people do, and as more people do cycling, which I think will happen through gravel, I think it will just lose, that kind of edginess that I think a lot of people have found to be socially resonant. So despite those, right, clearly defined differences, or hopefully now clearly defined differences, I think it's probably fair to say there's a lot in common with these experiences. And that's why I'm calling this episode Power to Weight, because what we want to do is establish that idea, is like, what do these two sports have in common? Is there power to weight? Running is also a power to weight sport. What's incredible about some of these elite runners, Eliud Kipchoge, I saw a picture on Annemiek van Vleuten's Instagram the other day of her with Eliud Kipchoge, and like, you kind of know Eliud Kipchoge is small, but like he's smaller than Annemiek, right? And, she's definitely a compact, lean athlete, and super successful, probably will not receive, we talked about it being legendary, right? And how difficult it is to be recognized. But, I whatever recognition she gets when she's, done with elite competition, it's not going to be what it should be, because her capacity and what she's doing is just unbelievable. And I say that, very genuinely. I, really think that that's the case. Even, and I say that compared to not just, the history of the female athletes, but I'm just saying overall, like it's incredible. But, these runners, incredibly small, compact people, and to see that, right, here's the person to break 2 hours in the marathon. And let's not forget that when Eliud Kipchoge was 18 years old, he won the world championship 5,000 meters in 12:58 against, El Gurouj and Kenenisa Bekele, right? I think, if I'm remembering Kenenisa Bekele's, no, or was that Haile? 2003, he definitely took down El Gurouj. We'll have to fact check this and bring that up later for another podcast and clarify. But like at 18, right? And here he is now, the first person to run under 2 hours for the, marathon, and, dangerously close to a sub 2 hour marathon for a legitimate IAAF world record. Although I don't think that the sub 2 hour marathon was still a sub 2 hour marathon. I don't think you can knock that. But these runners, and in the sport of running, you're battling the same thing that cyclists are battling. And I think that as runners and cyclists, even if we only do one, I would say two things. I would say there's a lot to be learned about our sport by looking at where are these overlaps and where are these contrasts between, our side of this and then this other side. And I think, runners shouldn't be rejective of the value of cycling because, cycling has this sort of more countercultural bent to it when you start to really get into the social space of the sport sometimes. And I don't think that cyclists should be rejected of runners because they're, too vanilla or mainstream, or their training seems too regimented. And I think that, cyclists are actually probably a lot more regimented in their training than they're maybe willing to acknowledge. And the fact that you stop, and take pictures of your coffee doesn't mean that you aren't following a really, discipline-oriented training model, right? But how are those narratives, those ways we talk, right? Pictures are worth 1,000 words. How are the pictures we post, online? How do those influence how we think about these different sports? But seeing things similarly, I think, is really potentially valuable and meaningful for these two different sports. One example would be the context of how much should we do? So we talked about the 100-mile training week as which for people who are in the world of cycling and don't know about running, and maybe we're getting lost there, to break that down in the world of elite running historically, the 100-mile training week is held up as the sort of ultimate benchmark of high volume training, and then people who go over that are just considered alien. And that in cycling, right, you're talking more about maybe hours per week, and you can count the miles, but there's that your speed in training isn't really that important. But for runners are obsessed with their velocity, right, which they're not measuring that in miles per hour, they're measuring that in minutes per mile, right? And then they're trying to associate those speeds directly with, in cycling, we have those training zones. We're trying to associate those speeds directly with those training zones. But in cycling, we're using the watts to do that and the heart rate to do that. And running doesn't really take on the heart rate stuff. I think the reality is that basically no high school programs, and even though athletes are all now showing up, all is an overstatement, but a lot more and more athletes are showing up to cross-country practice in high school with GPS watches, with a heart rate function. And there aren't heart rate based training models being put into place on a mass scale. And the same thing's true in college. You don't really hear this being talked about as like, well, we're all training based off of heart rate. And could that happen down the road? Maybe, but the heart rate technology has been around for like decades and it still hasn't taken hold. So, I mean, there's got to be some sort of a barrier or block to that. Is that something that runners can, start to think about differently from cycling? Is like, okay, is calculating everything based off of pace, is that the best way to do that? As cyclists, on the other hand, like we know not only can like counting our miles per week is sort of like maybe not the most useful way to think about training, but we also, I think, know that, velocity can be very misleading. And I think we can get obsessed with, things like, averaging 20 miles an hour for rides. And, from Strava, you get the impression that for some people, velocity is the driving thing that they're looking at. But is that velocity really that helpful? Because terrain can make a big difference. And you also can go back to this power to weight concept. Like you can be a really powerful rider, and to go out and do effective training, you might need to go 16, 17 miles an hour. So I did some interesting research where Jillian Bennett, who I coach and work with on her training around her cycling, the first year she went and did the Pro National Road Race, kind of leading up to that, I looked at the entrance, and then for people who had, public Strava data, I just kind of did some profiling of say, okay, I kind of want to see like where these people are, right? Kind of get a sense of what is she doing versus, how does that compare to what other people are doing? And is there anything in here that's sort of predictive of success? And, I tried crunching some numbers in my kind of amateur mathematician way and looked for different factors. And you saw variance in how many hours per week was pretty big. You saw variance in miles. You saw variance in training speed. And none of this stuff really seemed to matter. But what ended up being very predictive of how well people seem to do at the national championship, but also overall with races was, and I had looked at the training they had done thus far in the calendar year. The more feet climbed per mile, the more effective that is. So for runners, right, if we want to maximize our velocity, what are runners going to do? Runners are going to go to the courses, and you see this, right, where like they're going to find the flattest loops they can. And it's crazy to me to hear the kinds of things that runners think are hilly. Like you have like a slight terrain variation. People are like, oh my God, there's this big hill. And cycling, in my experience with cycling, and I've done, racing on the bike for about probably a decade now. And I've done well over 100 races, and I've started doing more of the gravel racing too in the last couple of years myself, and not just the stuff on the road bike. But I've done a lot of this stuff, including dabbling in, stage race, and which, that's hard work right there. But it really makes you appreciate and think about hills totally differently. And for runners to be out there drilling velocity, is maybe not actually that productive. And maybe when we're thinking about this, stuff differently, can we learning from other sports, right? Can we learn as runners, from this cycling approach to be like, we don't want to count the miles. We don't really care about how fast we go. We need to have these other metrics. And you do see these power meters now for running, and I have not really thinking I want to invest in that because I'm not convinced that there's some way that strain gauge actually knows how many watts you're doing by putting a pod on your shoe. I don't understand how that technology works, and I'm not going to drop hundreds of dollars on something like that. It would be interesting if I knew that it worked, but, I don't know how that would make sense. So, and I feel like it would have to be just sort of like guesstimating based on your weight and your speed and your stride rate that this is the power, right? And that it's just sort of some more complicated pedometer function. But that's total speculation. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's awesome and super accurate and I need to get with the program. but different ways of quantifying and evaluating work, right? And we know as cyclists that we can be going fast and slow, and then we might be shocked to see, the variance in watts might sort of sometimes defy expectations. And famously, Team Sky and Bradley Wiggins and then Chris Froome, I think really brought to, the mainstream and an idea that I think really is an example of something stepping out of cycling culture and into the broader athletic space, right? Ideas of like marginal gains, but more specifically and probably more important was like riding to power and using their power meter as a pacing strategy. And then, that brings up the whole idea that it's cheating and it's not attacking. But the reality is you could take away the power meter and you could probably tell people to go, okay, do what's going to work and you're going to do that, right? Go to that. I want you to ride the best effort that you can do up and up every climb. Like I want you to average overall the fastest net speed that you can up all of the, climbs on today's stage. And they'd probably go out and do basically, maybe exactly the same thing. If you took away Eliud Kipchoge's watch, I think it's very likely he would run probably the exact same time, plus or minus 5 seconds for the marathon. Because I think when you really get to such a high level of fitness, you can't get there without understanding more about your body, and that system of measurement becomes like a language. Did Pavel Nurmi really need the stopwatch, or did that just sort of become like this mechanism to think? And I remember that Tom Dumoulin, who's retired now, but really ripped it up for a few years on the bike. The story was that on the time trials he didn't want any information, and he just wanted to focus on how he felt, right? And he exceptional, right? Was very close to being somebody to win the Giro and the Tour, and I think his results that year in 2018 in the his Giro Tour double, I think, are one of the most impressive things to happen in cycling in the history of the sport, and I think it's probably underrated. So, right, this sort of battle of like perception, like how do we think about this stuff? Because power to weight is about like work, and you can feel your body working against the resistances that are imposed on it, and I think that means that there's a meaning to intuitiveness. And when I coached, in that cross-country context, I actually took a lot of ideas from cycling training and I applied that. Like we used the language of the zones and the training zones, and that's how I used that in kind of like the subjective descriptions of what those should feel like, because obviously we don't have the power meters for the runners the way you can stick them on your bike. Nor would we have had the financial resources to do that anyway. But we talked about the zones, and that's how we thought about our training, and that became our language. And I think that was really key to our success, because that also opened the door to like, okay, there's a different way to think about this than just thinking about race-specific intensity and working at different percentages of race intensity, right? And it's very common for runners even at a very high level, in the United States to talk about like, well, mile pace, 3,000 meter pace, 5,000 meter pace, 10,000 meter pace. And I don't really agree with that concept, because I think your fitness is going to change throughout the year. And so the pace that is going to change. And the appropriateness of working that intensity can change. But I also think we see like the limitations with the power meter too. Like the power meter both points to the fact that there's maybe better ways to think about your effort, but it also points to like the limitations of like, okay, once you have an external mechanism to try to quantify effort like you're a machine, like you now bring in, you're just sort of calling up those discipline ideas, right? That training and hitting your numbers is an act of discipline. And in cycling, you'll have people who socially project as super countercultural, and it's like they're keeping their sort of, very, their discipline thing is like very like locked down and kept away, because it's like, you sometimes wonder like, are you allowed as a cyclist to do that? Because that's not, sufficiently, the social, countercultural norm of being a free-spirited cyclist who's against the grain and blah, 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 right? And, that kind of dialogue, maybe does that repress how we think about this stuff? But, for cycling, we know that there's a huge difference and a huge benefit to like, the courses that we pick, right? And like changing the amount of climbing we do on a ride matters significantly. right? And because that's going to really engage our training and our fitness. And with Jillian, what we try to do is we try to do a lot of riding, and then we try to do, loops that have hills. And, where we're training, we're not in some sort of mountain foothills area, but I don't think you need to train in the mountains, and I don't think you need to train at elevation. I think you just need to do lots of things that are, frequently, require you to have to work. And, by doing rides that are just hilly, and there's just steep pitch after steep pitch after steep pitch after steep pitch, and there's no long sections where you can just sit there and just, spin away, with, your heart rate, but then not really doing any work with the muscles. And, so you get really strong from training, like that in that context. And my youngest brother, who's also raced the Pro National road race, and, has an FTP that I think when he's at peak fitness is probably 5.5 to 5.8 watts per kilogram. And if you don't want to believe me, that's fine. But, we have the data to show this. And, like when we see this stuff, like it's not coming from, these like micromanaged workouts, right? And so this is an extension of what I saw with the cross country team, right? Is that we don't need these specific, race intensity things. And then we're going and, we're doing this stuff and approaching the concept of the stress in a different way. And like looking at the rhythm of training. And I think when you're doing, for example, both of these activities together, I think it starts to change the way you think. Because when you only ever experience one, I think, as a consequence, right, that's your language, that's how you're going to talk when you talk about sport. And I interact with people in cycling who can't conceive of, running at all. That's absurd. And it's like, a horrifying concept. And they, insist they would never do it. And runners are, I find, more open to cycling, but their attitude is, I think, oftentimes that, cycling is this thing that you do if you're hurt, right? If you're injured, it's a form of cross-training, and so it's like, therefore, less productive than you're running. And I think that those mentalities aren't really true. And one of the things I want to talk about, in this podcast overall is how I think that there's a model of endurance training now where doing, like, cycling and running in conjunction is a superior way to train for both sports, even if you're only looking to compete in those sports. And the way we can get to that understanding is by talking about this stuff in different ways and trying to recognize what's important or significant to consider. So, but circling back to the sort of idea of like volume and like, can we think of different ways and how we might quantify training? So, hours per week, cyclists talk about doing 20 hours a week as sort of a standard. And then we talk about doing 30 hours a week as like this sort of like that. 30 hours a week, I think, seems to me be the cycling equivalent of the running 100-mile week. And in running terms for cyclists, like if you're an elite runner, maybe you're averaging across all of your training 6-minute pace. Well, that means you're doing 10 hours a week. Maybe you have additional work in there, and maybe you get up to 120 miles a week. So maybe you're doing like 12 or 13 hours a week, which for a cyclist is like crazy, right? But I think in cycling, when you look at that volume, like how much of that is really effective? How much time are you actually really sort of engaging that power to weight system? See, because when the runner is working out, like they're not doing the hours that you're doing on the bike because they're limited, right, by the fact everything they do is working against that power to weight, even to some extent running downhill. But like when you're running, I think of running sometimes as just like this endurance plyometric, because, in walking, you always have 1 foot on the ground, 1 foot, 2 feet, 1 foot, 2 feet. And then running, you only have 1 foot on the ground. And then you have these periods, obviously, where you're jumping through the air. And so that makes it plyometric. So, and even when you're running downhill, you're still launching yourself through the air, right? It's just that now gravity is a little bit more of your ally than your adversary. But you're working the whole time. You can recover on the downhill, but like, it's not like in cycling where, in some of these races, you can just basically get in the drops and be going 50 to 60 miles an hour downhill and doing nothing except trying not to freaking die, right? I remember being like, you see stuff about people in these big races, hitting these speeds, and it's, becomes sort of abstract because it's on TV. But, when my brother did the GMSR race, one year where it was extremely cold and raining, he talked about on the descent from the first of the three climbs, I think getting up to 63 or 65 miles an hour, and to me, that's just when you hear that and you're actually doing that, that's holy crap, and because you realize what happens. And you see this sometimes in the tour, people go off the road on these descents and it's not pretty, right? And there's risk involved in cycling in a way that there just really isn't with running. And maybe that helps running on a mass participation level because, that danger, that risk, that potential risk isn't as high. Although it's certainly true that, if you're prudent with cycling, you can, really, minimize that, limit that. So setting, these, crazy speeds aside, right? You have this huge variance, right, in work, and you have periods of work and non-work. So you might be riding, I think a 3-hour ride, to me is sort of maybe not physiologically proportional to, but I think, a 3-hour ride is kind of similar to maybe an 8 to 10 mile run. Those are going to take totally different amounts of time, but I think in terms of kind of the amount of fatigue and sort of generic benefit, which if you can say that a specific length of ride or length of run has benefit, that's different. And I think for riders too, though, again, you're seeing the difference of we're quantifying our, units of training in time, right? Runners are going to do mile repeats, but cyclists are going to do 20-minute repeats. And thinking about that sort of, how do we measure work duration? So one of the things that we did as a standard training exercise in college for cross country is going to this Nordic Ski Trail Center and running loops, different loops on the trails. And it would be on a set clock, kind of like in the pool. So everybody would start, and it might be a 2,000 meter loop or something, or a 3,000 meter loop. So it might the best people might do it in, I'm sort of guesstimating the times, but maybe they're doing it in 9:50, right? And the whole thing might be on 13 minutes or something. And then I would come through in 11:40 or whatever. And, the point we're trying to illustrate here is so I'm working now an additional 2 minutes, which might not seem 2 minutes to a cyclist might not seem like much, but, in running terms, especially when the work interval is, for the fittest people on the team is, 9 minutes and 50 seconds, you add 2 more minutes to that, that's more than 20% additional work. Plus, I'm doing 20% more work, and it's cutting in to the total interval, right, of recovery. Because I'm not getting, so I'm doing 20% more work, and that's taking away from my recovery, and then we're doing this maybe 4 times. And, the concept of the workout wasn't okay, you're working at this sort of different zone, right? It wasn't well, you're supposed to be in zone blank, so it's gonna be longer work, and you don't need as much recovery, but these guys are in this other zone. It wasn't I was in zone 3 and they're in zone 4 to 5. We were all supposed to be doing the same thing because it was based on this, race intensity model, right? We were basically supposed to be out there doing race pace, essentially. And, the model was to sort of equate these performances to, an equivalence of, what would that be predictive of in terms of 8K. But then the issue of recovery, I think, would make it difficult sometimes to go and do that. And, we had a session where we did mile repeats, and this is embarrassing for me, but it's what happened. We did mile repeats with a 90-second rest, and I did them all in 5:30, and I was the eighth best guy on the team because it was important that we ranked ourselves as if it was a race. And, so I had the eighth best workout, and I averaged 5:30 pace running through these rolling trails in the woods. So if you're running on a track, it probably would have been 5:20 or 5:15 pace or something like that, which nothing like, barnstorming. But I did this, and it was like, whoa, you're like, you're almost in the top 7. I was like, yeah, I'm almost in the top 7. That's sick. And then 3 days later, we went down to the ECAC meet, and I ran probably 31:48 or something. And I just still have a memory of, like, by the end of the race, and this might not have been true, but just feeling like I was the only person on the course. And it was insane. Like, I could not run, right? And the reality is I had used that effort in there. But if we start to apply concepts from cycling, we can think about the effort that we're doing. And for me to be going out there doing some sort of, effort that was basically probably effectively in zone 5, I think in cycling terms, we would probably want to recognize that as being, unproductive to do 3 days before, for me, that was the last race of the season. So for me anyway, like, you would presume to think the biggest race. I wouldn't tell Jillian to go out and do 3 times, 10 minutes at, 280 watts or 300 watts 3 days before, racing in Knoxville, or racing Unbound or racing, the Tulsa Tough Criteriums. That'd be never something we'd do, right? And, so we're more focused on we recognize that as being stupid because, of other things, like kind of overall we have an approach that's being driven by some of the things that I've talked about already. But I think even if you didn't, I think in cycling you'd be like, well, obviously that's totally stupid and fatiguing. But in running, because of this bias of velocity, right, you tend to look at that, right? And if you're cycling, if you're really focused on velocity and you're like, okay, well, this race is going to be at 25 miles an hour, which is, we know in cycling is a dumb concept also because of all the drafting, right? That the average speed of a race, like, isn't necessarily that helpful. You got to know what the course is like, how big is the peloton going to be, and then, like, what's the hardest part of the course. But in a velocity-only paradigm, right, you might be anxious and be like, okay, I got to go out, and I got to, once again, I got to go out and drill 25 miles an hour. But when you go to that course in Knoxville, you're recognizing that, well, what this course really is this is just going up this hill. So, like, the whole thing is, ironically, like an interval workout. And it actually plays out every year, I would argue, like an interval workout. Because like the interval workouts I've done where, I talked about, the mile repeat showdowns on the track in college where people would get to the end of the sessions and, despite, being their training program was to run 5:08s or something, now they're running 4:37, or where we're doing 8 by 800s with probably like a minute to 90-second recovery. And by the end, guys are running 2:02, 2:03, right? Where it's just like, how did we not have 7 guys running 25:30 to 24:20? I don't understand, because the stuff that people were doing in training, really indicated a level of ability that just wasn't coming out in the racing. But I think that says something about fatigue and, again, like adrenal use and like using up not just the physical energy, but also like some of that mental enthusiasm for that. And like that race in Knoxville, that's kind of what that looks like too, is people are just out there smashing each other up the climb. And to me, it feels like, in the women's race in particular, that there's this sort of like this sort of like elite class of people who have like an international, racing, status, going out there and just progressively taking people to the woodshed on that climb just every lap, right? And that idea of like the interval workout being a competition of like, and then the peloton, relatively speaking, basically not doing anything the rest of the way and around the course. And I think a part of that, I'm not saying that to insult or belittle the athletes whatsoever, and I hope it's not coming across that way. But I just think there's an interesting parallel to that dynamic. And so, is there value for cyclists maybe? Like, is there something to be learned from, would our runners on the college team have been better prepared, or was that really what they were learning to do, right? Or are we turning the national road race in Knoxville? Are we turning that into just sort of like a discipline thing where like rather than being like, okay, we got to duke this out over the whole course, we're going to turn this into this like discipline test where collectively the consciousness of the group is like, okay, the shared road climb is hard enough that we're going to just like, increasingly rip each other's legs off. But then it also gives ground to the breakaway, really easily, because if you're only riding hard up a climb, which, is like, around 2 minutes, you're not going to pull people back and, in that regard. And so it looks like they're just sort of not doing anything, but I think it becomes all about the climb and, testing yourselves against the climb, and sort of like the big dogs, have that sort of like on lockdown, and, obviously like those kinds of dynamics about, cycling, racing, you can go on into that. Like that's the nature of the sport. And I'm not saying that's bad, but it's very different from running, because in running you have more of an ability to directly impose your will on the field of experience. And, it's interesting that in cycling, right, is our training kind of cause us to default to that? Is the reason why the field doing that, is that because of the ways? So what we're getting at here is that these sports have different, despite the fact that what I'm saying is these sports are very similar. They're both driven by this power to weight concept, and they should be looking at each other and being like, okay, we're both trying to solve the same problem. And then, the events that we do, the machines we use, right? Some people are just using our body and shoes, and then, other people are using, the machine of the bicycle. But like the ways we're expressing that power to weight competition is very different. But those differences, and then culturally, right, we're different. But those differences are preventing us from maybe seeing the levels of similarities, which are like actually like way more common than they are. But do the ways in which these different sports isolate themselves and apply their own system to try to quantify what they're talking about in terms of training, does that then feed into different styles of racing? Like for running, it's like not, running I think has become less tactical, and I'm hoping to have my dad on the podcast at some point. He was interstate cross-country champion, Massachusetts and Connecticut, his senior year in high school, and was a pretty dominant runner at Bowdoin, and had set a bunch of records at the school and at meets, and that held out for 30 plus years in some instances. And one of the things he talks about how is like, the point of racing is to race, and that, when people are just out here chasing these times, like it's not really like what makes the sport exciting, because then it just becomes this drag race. But even when running is tactical, there's still that sense of like seize the initiative, put the hammer down, and that you can just sort of try to impose your will over everybody else. That kind of like Alberto Salazar, and I'm referring to Alberto Salazar as a racer, and kind of what he sort of identified with, or somebody like Henry Rono, right, and what he was able to do as a racer, or even maybe Jerry Lindgren and what he did. And you can start to go on and identify more people. But in cycling, we don't necessarily always see that. But then if you think about people like, Wout van Aert, Annemiek van Vleuten, Mathieu van der Poel, Chris Froome, Lance Armstrong, who, yes, he got whatever about the doping stuff, but like, doping, everybody else who doped, we're still allowed to discuss what they tell us about the sport. So I think it would be stupid to act like, oh no, we can't, use the Lance Armstrong years as information about sport, because it happened, right? And it's tangible and it's evidence and it's part of the history of the sport. But like you do see like the really, best remembered cyclists are people who are able to find a way to impose their will. And, obviously they're relying heavily on help from other people. And then like, the narrative tends to hype that up. But in cycling, can we benefit from understanding more about how running and the sport of running is developing to get people to impose their will, because even though runners are training, even at what we're saying is even at like the peak volume of what runners do, they're doing, 50% to 35% of what the peak volume of cyclists will do. And yet they're able to do these, incredible things and just sustain these efforts, which I think cyclists would love to be able to go and hit climbs with that kind of performance. But a lot of cyclists struggle to do that. And the way cyclists try to quantify training, watts and then hours, and then hear about 30 hours a week, and nothing really results from that. And what I found, so circling back to the Knoxville race and that research I did, that first year Jillian competed in that, what I found is the only thing that was really predictive of success was feet per mile in training. So per mile of training or volume unit of training, how much climbing did they do? Right? What was their average elevation per mile? And, I talked earlier in the podcast about, my brother saying that like 100 feet per mile is the gold standard. And that's how he thinks about that in his training approach and with his especially I think with his bike riding. I haven't talked to him about, how he thinks about elevation gain with running, but, for me, for running and riding, I've also thought about that. And so I know we've shared kind of notes and ideas about this, but there's also an element of us semi-independently reaching similar or the same conclusions about this, right? And so running is saying that like, okay, we're not doing as much as cyclists, but we're getting these really incredible aerobic capacities. And then cyclists are looking to do more and more volume and like are willing, I'm doing 30 hours a week and whatever. And it's like, whoa. But, it's not like that's okay. Well, now those people are just riding off the front in mass and leaving everybody behind. And then to be fair, with that sample that I looked at for the women's entrance for that race, like there weren't a bunch of people doing that. And I think the average volume was like closer to 10 than it was to 20. And maybe a part of that, speaks to, just the difficulty of being a full-time student or having a job and then somehow exercising, 20 plus hours a week. Although I think, if you divide it up, you don't try to do it all in one setting, I think it's maybe not quite as difficult as you might imagine, although it's certainly still challenging, and I acknowledge that. But I also think it tells us something about like the diffuseness of understanding about training in cycling, that there aren't these common things. And so like the common understandings in running can be like obstacles too. But I think that sometimes the, marginal counterculture nature of cycling means that like finding information about it, it's hard enough to find training information for running these days, despite the internet. Let's Run is like such a weird place. I don't really feel that reading, the message boards is really going to help you that much, although it's like pretty interesting if you have just like an ethnographic curiosity. And by the same token, I don't really see that with cycling. Perhaps more so, it's harder to find useful information. You really have to dig, and then you quickly hit that, biochem barrier, exercise physiology barrier. You have to be willing to engage with that. And I think for a lot of people, that's like the straw that breaks the camel's back. And then I think like you see like things like Training Peaks really start to drive the dominant paradigm for that. But you could then ask like, well, what about the volume? So if cycling volume like isn't as productive per unit of time, right? And then we're also not doing a massive amount of time to try to like compensate for that. Whereas if like a run, like if you run for an hour, like every second of that hour is productive. But if you ride for an hour, like there's so many variables that could like basically make that the equivalent of doing like a 15 to 20 minute run. And that 15 to 20 minutes of like actual beneficial work might not even be continuous within the ride, right? And so then you start doing these ridiculous volumes to get the same kind of benefit that you could do like if you had a different concept of how to approach your training and you designed your loops differently, right? And so what we're doing is like, I'm just trying to open the bean can here on how can we talk about both of these things at the same time and start to build better ideas about training for both. And I think that, the takeaway is that we all really want to recognize that, okay, the power to weight battle, that's the battle that we're fighting in these sports, right? Cycling, we feel that acutely when we're climbing, and you need to be able to climb. If you're, a bigger, sort of higher power rider, like you still need to be able to climb. It's just you're going to excel at climbs that are shorter in duration. And if you're a lighter, and you have a really good power to weight ratio, but maybe not the overall power, you really have to have that down for, those long climbs, right? You have to be able to climb well for that. So if you want to be successful in cycling, you have to be able to climb. It's just that the climbing is going to be different in different ways. And I think that's like the make or break, right? And the same power to climb is also the power, to a similar concept to how do I break away? How do I ride independently? So I want to welcome the cyclists here too, and I don't want you to feel like your experience is marginalized. I'm just as curious about, what can we learn about cycling as anything else. And I hope that this initial foray into this is helping everybody see that there's like this really cool, exciting synergy here where, what we get from combining these two things together, that whole is definitely going to be greater than the sum of its parts. And picking that apart is something I'm really excited to do. And I hope that you're now seeing the possibilities in that as well. So that's it for this episode. There will not be a multi-part breakdown for this. But again, feel free to check out and follow on the Instagram. And if you have thoughts about this kind of stuff, we'll create spaces or posts where people can comment and discuss and see if we can kind of develop some dialogue and get more ideas of what would be interesting to talk about. All right, that's it for this episode. Catch you next time.